Welcome to Beyond Borders, the Immigration Evaluation Podcast. Whether you're just starting to explore how to add immigration evaluations to your practice, or you've been conducting evaluations for years, this is the place for you. I'm Dr. Mariella Shibley, and I can't wait to share today's episode with you. Hey there, and welcome back to the podcast. Today, I want to talk about something that might seem small or even minor at first glance, but it actually has a pretty big impact on the quality of our immigration evaluations. And it's this: how do we capture and communicate a client's fears, especially when those fears might sound exaggerated or even irrational, without making them seem less credible? So let me start with a quick example. I was just reviewing a report the other day, and it mentioned that the client was really distressed after receiving an abnormal pap smear result. And when I say distressed, I mean terrified. She was convinced that this meant she had cancer, possibly something terminal. Now, as clinicians, we know that abnormal pap smears are incredibly common, right? Most of the time, it's nothing serious. They're followed by a biopsy for further testing, not because cancer is expected, but because it's just routine. It's just part of the process, standard protocol. But here's where it gets tricky. When that fear is written into a report without the proper framing, it can sound like the client is already dealing with a cancer diagnosis. And that can unintentionally undermine the credibility of the report. So the question becomes, how do we, as evaluators, write about this kind of fear in a way that honors the client's emotional experience without making it look like they're catastrophizing or out of touch with reality? Here's another example. This is a great one. I once had a client say to me when discussing the potential hardships of a relocation, she very seriously looked at me and she said, "Well, Mexico is like a jungle. There are animals everywhere." Now, if I wrote that sentence exactly as it was said, word for word, into the report, I would raise some eyebrows, right? It might sound silly or even a little unhinged. And unfortunately, that one sentence could color the way that the entire report is perceived. You start to question the client's perception of reality. But here's the thing. Underneath that statement is a very real emotion. It's a very real fear. This client wasn't literally saying that there are tigers roaming the streets in Mexico. What she was expressing was how overwhelming and frightening the idea of relocating was for her. It felt wild, chaotic, dangerous, completely unlivable in her mind. So yes, the words sounded exaggerated, but the emotion was completely valid. And also, let's talk about where that fear comes from, because it often has roots, right? Clients might have very limited exposure to the country that they're talking about. Maybe they've never lived there or only know it through family stories or media coverage that's heavily skewed toward violence or corruption. So when someone says it's like a jungle, they might be pulling from cultural narratives, from these warnings or fear-based headlines that they've seen over and over. It's not really about wildlife, right? It's about feeling like the environment is uncontrollable and unsafe. So we, as the evaluators, need to translate that emotional reality into something that makes sense to a skeptical reader. We have to help the adjudicator understand what's behind the words. I've also seen this come up quite a bit when I'm supervising trainees or reviewing reports written by newer evaluators. So often they want to quote the client word for word, thinking that it adds authenticity or emotional weight to the report. And yes, there is a time and a place for that, for sure. But without framing, sometimes those raw quotes can backfire. So one common mistake that I often see is including dramatic or emotional language, especially in the summary sections of the report, especially without clearly signaling that it's part of the client's perception. So when an adjudicator reads something like, "She said her children will die if they return," without any additional explanation, then it can come across as irrational or manipulative, or make you sound like an advocate, even if that's not at all how it was intended. So I always encourage trainees, and I remind myself also, to always ask, what is the emotional meaning behind the statement? How can I translate this into psychological terms that will resonate with the reader without diluting the client's experience? So sometimes a simple phrase like, well, the client perceives or she fears that, or in her view, can help anchor a bold statement in the client's lived reality without making it sound like a factual claim that we're endorsing. So it's not about censoring, it's about translating. Quick break. If you love what you're hearing and want to get started with immigration evaluations, grab my free introductory guide to immigration evaluations. It's linked in the description box, and it is packed with everything you need to know about the different types of evaluations, writing strong reports, and avoiding common pitfalls. Download it now. Now let's get back to the episode. Now here's why this matters so much. When I read a report, whether as a psychologist, an attorney, or even as an adjudicator, I'm not just looking at symptoms. I'm forming an impression of how the client thinks, how they perceive the world, and whether they come across as reasonable and credible. If a client appears to be catastrophizing something that's usually routine, or if their descriptions sound a little far-fetched, it can make the reader pause. They might think, if this part is exaggerated, what else might be exaggerated? Is this person overstating the emotional impact of their trauma, their depression, their fears? That's not the direction we want the reader's mind to go. We want them to stay connected to the human experience and definitely not pulled into doubt. And that puts us in kind of a tricky spot, right? On one hand, we want to be true to the client's voice. We want to honor their distress. Their feelings are real and they matter. But on the other hand, we have to think strategically. We have to consider how that report will be read by someone who doesn't know the client, who may be under pressure to make a quick decision, and who might already be a little skeptical to begin with. So how do we walk that line? We want to focus on the emotional truth, not necessarily the literal words that the client used. So instead of writing, she's terrified that she has terminal cancer after an abnormal pap smear, you could write something like, well, she expressed heightened anxiety and feelings of vulnerability after a recent medical concern, which has intensified her overall emotional distress. Or instead of, she said Mexico is like a jungle with animals everywhere, you could say, well, she described significant fear about the idea of relocating, expressing that she would feel overwhelmed and unsafe in an unfamiliar environment. So you see the difference? Both versions are honest, both respect the client's emotional state, but the second ones present that fear in a way that maintains credibility. Now, sometimes it's not just emotion. Sometimes there is real, relevant context that explains the intensity of the fear. So going back to that medical example, if the client's mother died of ovarian cancer, then of course an abnormal pap smear would trigger panic. In that case, we should include the context. So something like, well, given her family history of ovarian cancer, the recent medical findings have been particularly distressing for her, triggering fears of a similar outcome, something like that. And that's not exaggeration, that's a nuance. And it helps the reader understand why the fear is as intense as it is. So here are some quick takeaways. Number 1, validate the emotion. The client's fear is real, even if the situation seems small or routine to us. It's very real to them. Be selective with examples. So ask yourself, will this help or hurt the client's credibility? Again, we don't have to include every single thing that they say to us. Also, reframe extreme statements. So any hyperbolic language that they give you, you can translate into more meaningful emotional content.
Along those same lines, we want to add context when needed. So don't assume that the fear is irrational. We want to look deeper, like in the case of the medical condition, and put this fear in context. And if it's relevant, include that in the report. And then lastly, stay grounded in the psychological impact. That's our lane. That's what we're here to communicate. So we're not going to put on our physician's hat and start talking about what that would mean and what the statistics are of developing cancer, etc. Right? So we stay on our lane. And before we wrap up, I want to offer one more lens that can be really helpful here. And that is trauma-informed interpretation and cultural humility. When someone's reaction feels disproportionate to us, it's often because we're viewing it through our own lens, our training, our culture, our experience of safety and control. But our clients may come from contexts where the healthcare system is unreliable, where trust in authority is low, or where trauma has shaped their perception of risk in ways that we can't fully see. Now, that doesn't mean that we disregard clinical standards or throw out the structure. It means we slow down. We take time to wonder, what might have shaped this fear? What experiences might make this response feel not just understandable, but inevitable? When we do that, we move beyond surface level impressions. We stop pathologizing fear and we start contextualizing it. And that's really the heart of this work. Understanding the person in front of us within the full scope of their lived experience and communicating that understanding clearly, compassionately, and credibly. So in closing, these reports are not just about checking boxes or listing symptoms. They're about telling the client's story in a way that's clinically sound and legally useful. So next time you're writing and you come across a sentence that makes you pause, something that feels a little over the top, ask yourself, am I capturing the client's emotional reality in a way that actually builds their credibility? Because sometimes just a small shift in wording can completely change how a report is received. Well, that's it for today. I hope this episode gave you a new lens for thinking about how we write, and I will catch you next time. Thanks for tuning in. If you loved this episode, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a review or shoot me an email. I'll see you next time.